for what he'd done for me and my husband. I never got to thank him personally, but this is our way of saying thank you, so it's going to Childline.
That's lovely.
It's what he supported.
George Michael sold the kind of fame you can measure. More than 14 million copies of Faith alone. A face that could stop a decade. A voice that could turn heartbreak into a pop religion. But the number that doesn't fit the legend is smaller. Pound 15,000. One day, a stranger on British television says his wife needs that exact amount for IVF. The next day, the money appears quietly without cameras, because George Michael asked for one thing. Don't tell anyone it was him. So how does a man powerful enough to fight Sony as professional slavery, generous enough to change lives in secret, still end up dying at home on Christmas morning, alone? In the 1980s, George Michael didn't just arrive on the charts. He arrived as a national mood. Wham! Turned youth into export-grade electricity, and George learned early what most artists learn late. The public doesn't simply listen to music, it buys a story. When he stepped out alone, Faith didn't merely succeed. It set the scale for what a pop star could be. Big enough that every smile became a brand asset, every silence became a headline, and every new song was expected to repeat a miracle. But the same machine that lifted him also narrowed him. The late 80s and early 90s were a period when record contracts could feel like long corridors with locked doors. Deliver the albums, follow the marketing plan, stay visible, stay simple, stay profitable. George, who had the craft to write hooks and the instincts to chase something darker and more personal, began to resist the version of himself that was easiest to sell. That resistance is where his story stops being a standard rise and fall and becomes something closer to a case study in power. A pop icon trying to renegotiate the terms of his own identity. An identity, for him, wasn't a branding exercise, it was a daily pressure. The era's public conversation around sexuality was brutal and simplistic. The AIDS crisis hung over the culture like a warning siren, and for many gay men of that generation, privacy wasn't luxury, it was survival. George moved through fame while carrying parts of himself he couldn't safely place on the table, and the tension between what he felt and what he was expected to perform didn't disappear when he became rich. It intensified. Behind the scenes, love and loss shaped his inner weather. Anselmo Felipa wasn't just a partner in the biography sense. He represented a private life that briefly felt possible, then became a wound that never fully closed. Kenny Goss later embodied a different kind of stability. Longer, quieter, more domestic. Yet even that could fracture under the weight of celebrity's constant extraction. Then came the harsh public chapters, moments when the tabloids didn't merely report on him. They tried to define him, reduce him, fix him into a single cautionary image. Some artists respond by disappearing, others by turning the spectacle into a weapon. George did both at different times, fighting the industry in court, mocking the scandal with art, retreating, returning, repeating the cycle. And through all of it ran a contradiction most people never saw until after he was gone. The same man who could be portrayed as reckless or defiant was also methodical about kindness, choosing routes that left no fingerprints. The 15,000-pound IVF gift wasn't an exception. It was a clue. The question isn't whether George Michael was complicated. Fame makes everyone complicated. The question is why his complexity kept pulling him toward the same two outcomes. Public myth on one side, private loneliness on the other, as if the distance between them kept growing no matter how much he gave away to close it. The first thing to understand about George Michael is that his story wasn't built on a single tragedy or a single mistake. It was built on friction, the constant grinding between what he wanted to be and what the world paid him to perform. Long before the stadiums and the glossy magazine covers, there was a boy growing up with a Greek Cypriot father and an English mother, raised between cultures, between expectations, between versions of masculinity that didn't leave much room for softness or ambiguity. Fame didn't invent that tension. It amplified it. When Wham! Exploded, George learned the oldest rule in entertainment. The audience will reward you for clarity and punish you for complexity. The early image was bright and simple, youthful, flirtatious, easy to digest, and it worked so well that the industry tried to freeze him there, like a photograph that should never age. Then Faith arrived and became a phenomenon, and that kind of success creates its own cage. When you sell millions, you don't just gain freedom, you become an economy. There are tours, marketing schedules, radio strategies, executives who see you not as a person but as a pipeline, and every time you try to change direction, you're reminded how many salaries depend on you staying the same. George, however, had always been more ambitious than his own poster. He wanted to write songs that weren't only seductive, but honest. He wanted to step away from the cartoon outline of a pop idol and speak in a quieter, more adult language. That's where the first deep fracture formed. The public loved George Michael the symbol, while George Michael the artist wanted to disappear into the work. And beneath that artistic conflict was another, far more intimate conflict: identity under surveillance. In the era he came up in, privacy wasn't just preference. It was protection. Being gay in the public eye wasn't simply a personal truth. It was a headline weapon, a career risk, a moral panic trigger for tabloids that lived on humiliation. The AIDS crisis, the fear, the judgment, the cultural cruelty, these weren't abstract ideas. They were the atmosphere. So George learned to split himself, one self for the stage and interviews, and one self for the life that actually mattered. Living split like that doesn't always break you immediately. It breaks you slowly through thousands of small edits: how you talk, how you stand, who you can hold hands with, what you can admit you need. The more famous he became, the more expensive honesty felt, and the more exhausting it became to maintain the performance of ease. Then came love, and with it, the kind of joy that doesn't photograph well but changes everything. Anselmo Felipa wasn't just a romantic chapter. He was a private revolution. In him, George found a life that didn't require applause. A life where he could be ordinary for a few hours, where the room didn't belong to an audience. And then that life was taken away, swallowed by illness and the era's cruel timing, and grief did what grief often does to a person who can't mourn openly. It turned inward and became rage, control, and silence. This is where people misunderstand George's war with Sony. On paper, it looks like a superstar throwing a tantrum because he didn't get the marketing he wanted. In reality, it's closer to a man trying to reclaim his own body and voice at the exact moment he felt life was teaching him how little control he actually had. When George began describing his contract as professional slavery, it wasn't just a legal argument. It was an emotional diagnosis. He saw a system that could profit from him endlessly while limiting his autonomy, and he decided that if he couldn't control loss, he would control the one thing he could still fight for: his work. The lawsuit became a symbolic battle. Artist versus corporation, human versus machine. But the machine had law, precedent, and time. George lost the case, and losing it did something worse than cost him money. It taught him that even at his level, there were doors he couldn't unlock. When you fight a giant and lose, you don't just walk away bruised. You walk away with a new relationship to the world, one where optimism feels naive and trust feels like a gamble. The aftermath wasn't simply a delay in releases. It was a reshaping of identity. George became more guarded, more selective, more suspicious of the bargain fame demands. And yet, he never stopped making art. He just changed the way he offered it, choosing depth over constant visibility, choosing to withdraw rather than feed the machine that had defined him. That withdrawal, however, left space for another kind of storm: scandal as a cultural ritual. When the public finally encountered parts of George's private life through headlines and legal trouble, it wasn't treated as human complexity. It was treated as entertainment, proof that the idol had cracks. Here again, George's response mattered. Some artists collapse under that gaze. George, at times, fought back by turning the spectacle into satire, refusing to be shamed, refusing to let the press write the final version of him. But a defiant public mask doesn't automatically heal private pain. It can even become a trap of its own. If you're always performing strength, you have fewer places to admit you're tired. Add in the pressures of addiction and coping, struggles he faced in different phases, and the story gains another layer. Not a star behaving badly, but a person using whatever tools he can find to dull the noise, to quiet the relentless demand to be endlessly watchable. This is the point where his life begins to resemble a pendulum. Visibility, backlash, retreat, then return, reinvention, backlash again. And because George was talented enough to keep surviving the cycle, people assumed survival meant health. But surviving isn't the same as being safe inside yourself. The true clue to George's interior world isn't found in a court document or a tabloid front page. It's found in what he did when nobody was looking. The £15,000 IVF gift is almost too perfect as a metaphor. A precise amount, a precise need, delivered with a precise instruction. Don't credit me, don't turn this into a story, don't make my kindness part of the marketplace. That insistence matters. It suggests that George understood something many celebrities learn the hard way. Public charity often comes with public bargaining. You give, and the world expects you to announce it. The announcement becomes branding. Branding becomes a shield, but also another cage. George's approach was different. He seemed to treat generosity like privacy. Something sacred, something that loses its meaning when it becomes a performance. If you trace his quiet giving across time, the reports of donations, the stories of debts paid for strangers, the moments when someone's life suddenly improved because a famous name reached out through intermediaries, you start to see a pattern of control that is paradoxically gentle. George couldn't fully control the headlines, couldn't control how the industry marketed him, couldn't control illness taking someone he loved, couldn't control the public's appetite for humiliation. But he could control a small miracle happening off camera. He could decide that one family would get a chance at a child. He could decide that a nurse would feel seen. He could decide that a charity would receive money without strings. In a life where so much was traded, negotiated, and consumed, secret kindness was one of the few acts he owned completely. Yet even this has a shadow. If your most meaningful actions must be hidden to remain pure, what does that say about the world you live in? And what does it do to you emotionally to keep the best parts of yourself invisible? This is where loneliness grows. Not because you don't have people around you. Fame ensures there are always people around you. But because intimacy requires a stable self, and George spent decades living in a shifting border zone between public myth and private reality. Love, when it came, carried the burden of secrecy. Grief, when it came, had to be managed, postponed, translated into lyrics instead of tears. Even domestic stability, when it arrived later, existed under the pressure of legal structures, media suspicion, and the complicated economics of being attached to a legend. Relationships became places where ordinary conflict could turn radioactive, because everything near George was touched by the gravitational field of his fame. And the more famous you are, the harder it becomes to know whether someone loves you or loves the idea of you. That uncertainty is corrosive. It makes a person withdraw, test people, build walls, then feel trapped behind them. Meanwhile, the public continues to play your greatest hits, expecting the soundtrack to remain unchanged while the human being behind it ages, aches, and tries to find peace. In the end, the deepest cause behind George Michael's contradictions might be this. He was trying to evolve as a person inside a system designed to keep him frozen as a product. He was trying to be truthful in a culture that treated truth like a scandal. He was trying to mourn in a world that monetized pain. He was trying to be generous without letting generosity become another costume. And he was trying, again and again, to regain control, not to dominate others, but to protect the parts of himself that fame kept trying to extract. When a man like that dies at home on Christmas morning, the tragedy isn't only in the fact of death. It's in the question that lingers in the air afterward. How many silent acts of love did he perform to keep himself afloat, and why did none of them fully build the one thing he needed most? A life where he could be wholly seen without being consumed. If George Michael's life is examined only as celebrity gossip, it shrinks into a list of headlines. But if it's examined as a structural story, it becomes a map of how modern fame and modern contracts reshape human beings. In that sense, George belongs to a lineage of artists who collided with systems larger than themselves, each collision revealing something different about the era. When Prince wrote "Slave" on his face and battled for ownership, he made the conflict visible. The artist versus the corporation, identity versus IP, a person versus a pipeline. George's conflict with Sony carried a similar pressure, but with a different emotional temperature, less theatrical defiance, more a wounded insistence that autonomy matters even when the marketplace says it doesn't. And then there is the contrast with Elton John, another British superstar who survived the same decades of media intrusion yet publicly rebuilt his life, turning openness into armor and stability into a long-term project. That contrast isn't a moral comparison. It's a demonstration of how timing, temperament, and cultural conditions shape outcomes. Elton's era of openness arrived with different social winds. George's youth unfolded when the conversation around sexuality was harsher, when the AIDS crisis made fear louder than empathy, and when the tabloids had fewer consequences for cruelty. When you compare George to Freddie Mercury, you see the shadow of that same historical pressure. Two icons, two private selves, two different ways of keeping intimacy out of the marketplace. The difference is that George lived long enough to watch society change, and to watch the public rewrite its rules, yet not always long enough to feel fully safe inside those new rules. That almost is where tragedy often hides, being close to freedom without ever fully relaxing into it. The comparisons widen further when you look at legal and cultural differences across countries. The American entertainment machine has its own brutality, paparazzi, scandal cycles, commercial churn, but Britain's tabloid culture has historically been a particular kind of pressure cooker. Relentless, intimate, fascinated with humiliation. In the U.S., celebrity scandals can be loud but fleeting. In the UK, they can become a persistent identity label that resurfaces whenever you attempt reinvention. That matters because George's story is largely a story of reinvention. Wham! To solo icon, pop seduction to adult confession, public flamboyance to private quiet. Reinvention requires space. A culture that keeps reopening old wounds steals that space. Then there is the question of relationships and rights, which becomes especially sharp in stories involving LGBTQ+ lives. The modern viewer can easily assume that love is love and partners are protected. But the late 80s and 90s were not built that way. In many places, the rights of same-sex partners were limited or non-existent, and even where legal frameworks improved later, the emotional damage of earlier decades didn't simply vanish. When you talk about why did he end up alone, you can't only talk about personality, you have to talk about the architecture around him, the years when being open could feel like professional risk, when the public could treat your private life as public property, and when even domestic stability could exist under a kind of invisible legal and cultural scrutiny. Now place that next to the economics of celebrity. Fame creates wealth, but wealth does not guarantee belonging. In fact, extreme wealth can distort belonging by attracting people who orbit your resources rather than your humanity. It forces you to wonder whether affection is real, whether loyalty has a price tag, whether your home is a sanctuary or a stage. George's later life controversies and whispers, the disputes and the suspicion, are not just drama. They are symptoms of how a famous life becomes a contested space. The house isn't just a house. The relationship isn't just a relationship. The legacy isn't just memories. It's assets, narratives, meanings. And in that contested space, the person at the center can become strangely absent, even while still alive, because everyone else is negotiating what he represents. That's the dark paradox of being iconic. You become too valuable to be allowed to be ordinary. The social consequence is not only personal loneliness but cultural distortion. The public learns to consume a person's pain as entertainment, then feels shocked when the person behind the pain looks exhausted. The industry learns to treat genius as renewable fuel, then wonders why artists burn out. Fans learn to love songs that sound like confession, then forget that confession is costly. George Michael's life shows the full loop. The system rewards the performance, punishes the truth, and then later, often too late, celebrates the courage it once made dangerous. And the most haunting consequence is what happens after. When stories like the £15,000 IVF gift finally surface, the public says, "We never knew." But perhaps the point is that we weren't meant to know. Perhaps his hidden generosity was not only kindness to others. It was kindness to himself, a private way to prove he was still more than the headlines, still capable of making something good happen without an audience. Yet that creates the final imbalance. The more he kept his best self invisible, the more the world's loudest picture of him was built by scandal, conflict, and myth. In the end, the global comparison is simple and brutal. Different countries, different media cultures, different laws, same underlying machinery, fame as extraction. George Michael fought that machinery in court, fought it in art, and fought it in silence. The question is not whether he won or lost. The question is how much of him was left after the fight, and why it took his absence for the world to finally see the shape of what he'd been protecting all along. The solutions in a George Michael story aren't the kind you can pass in a single law or fix with a single apology, because what broke the balance in his life wasn't one event. It was an ecosystem. Contracts that prioritize control over partnership, media systems that profit from humiliation, and cultural climates that once punished honesty so aggressively that secrecy became a survival skill. So the first solution has to be structural, not sentimental. The music industry needs contracts and deal norms that treat artists as co-owners of their work and their timeline, not just as output machines. That means clearer clauses around creative control, promotional obligations, release cadence, and mental health breaks. Because delivery schedules are easy to write on paper, but the human cost of living as a brand is rarely priced into the deal. A second solution is legal literacy as basic hygiene for artists. Not just hiring lawyers, but building independent advisory teams early, before fame hardens into obligations. George's war with Sony became famous because he had the power to fight, but the real lesson is that most artists don't, and the imbalance is designed. If you want fewer public implosions and more long careers, the incentives have to change. Labels should win when artists last, not when artists burn fast. The third solution is psychological. Celebrity culture still treats mental health as an optional footnote, something you mention after the documentary ends, not something you protect while the person is alive. But if we strip away the glamour, George's contradictions look like what happens when a human being is forced to live in permanent performance mode, where privacy is constantly negotiated, where intimacy is always at risk of becoming content. The industry and the media can't fix a person's inner life, but they can stop making the environment more hostile. No more rewarding invasive narratives, no more treating personal identity as scandal currency, and no more turning every misstep into a permanent label. That connects to a fourth solution, cultural and legal, especially relevant to LGBTQ+ lives. Safety isn't just personal acceptance, it's institutional protection. When societies normalize the idea that partners deserve dignity and rights, when legal frameworks and public norms stop treating queer intimacy as spectacle, artists don't have to spend decades splitting themselves into public and private selves just to survive. And then there is the most difficult solution, because it demands maturity from audiences, learning to separate knowing from owning. Fans often believe that love entitles them to a full biography, that admiration purchases access. But George's hidden generosity, like the £15,000 IVF gift, suggests a different moral. Some of the most meaningful acts lose their meaning when they become content. If we want fewer legends who die emotionally exhausted, we have to stop demanding that every human truth be converted into a public story. Looking forward, George Michael's legacy is likely to keep evolving in two directions at once. The first is obvious. The music remains, and each December it returns like a cultural reflex, reminding the world that his voice can still fill rooms even when he is gone. The second is quieter but potentially more powerful. The slow reassembly of his character through the stories that surfaced after his death. Acts of kindness that didn't seek applause, decisions that show a man trying to prove to himself that he was still capable of goodness even when the headlines were loud. In the long run, that might be the most modern kind of legacy. Not the perfect icon, but the complicated human being who fought for artistic autonomy, stumbled, stood up again, and kept giving anyway. The future lesson isn't be like George in a simplistic way. It's build systems where George don't have to suffer in silence to protect their humanity. Because if the world can learn anything from his contradictions, it's that talent is common compared to safety, and fame is abundant compared to belonging. And if we keep mistaking one for the other, we'll keep watching brilliant people shine, and then fade with too much of their best self still hidden in the dark. George Michael's life leaves behind a simple question that sounds almost unfair. If someone could move millions with a song, why couldn't he secure a life that felt safe, ordinary, and fully seen? The easy answer is to blame one scandal, one addiction, one lawsuit, one relationship. But the harder and more honest answer is that his story is what happens when a human being tries to grow inside a system built to keep him frozen. He fought for the right to own his work. He fought to define his identity on his own terms, and when the world demanded a performance, he sometimes answered with defiance, sometimes with silence. Yet the most revealing parts of him weren't the moments that made headlines. They were the moments he buried on purpose. The £15,000 that arrived without credit, the kindness that traveled through intermediaries, the choice to help without turning help into a brand. In the end, perhaps that was his private rebellion, proving that the best thing he could do with fame was create goodness that didn't need applause. And maybe that's also the tragedy, because goodness without applause is still goodness, but it doesn't always build the one thing a person needs most: belonging. If the story changed the way you see George Michael, if it made you hear those songs differently, leave a comment with the one track that feels like his real voice to you, not the poster version. Share this video with someone who thinks they already know his story. And if you can, consider supporting the kind of causes George quietly cared about, because the legacy he tried to hide might be the one worth carrying forward.